Hello and welcome to the Wildlife Trust Daily Update from COP26. And you're joining me today in the Blue Zone. This is the UN managed area where the majority of the negotiations are taking place. Because today is a very special day. The UK's COP presidency theme is all about nature. Now, we know we can't solve the nature crisis without solving the climate crisis as well. Climate change is one of the biggest reasons for nature's decline. And likewise, we need nature in the fight against climate change to allow us to lock up carbon emissions and also to adapt to climate change. We can't solve one problem without solving the other. So today we'll be looking at nature-based solutions and how nature can help us in the fight against climate change. We've got an interview with Sven Rasmussen from the Scottish Wildlife Trust, and we'll also be looking at some of the work the Wildlife Trusts have been doing with the People's Postcode Lottery. But first, over to Craig for an update of what's been happening at COP over the last 24 hours.
Of course, yesterday was Oceans Day at COP, and actually in the whole discussion around nature and climate, oceans don't receive nearly as much attention as they should do. Did you know that only 1% of climate finance is currently going to oceans? And yet we know that if we can put nature in recovery in our oceans, that could make a huge difference to the climate crisis. If we can restore the abundance of our fish populations, if we can restore the functioning of our salt marshes and seagrasses around our coasts, and in the tropics, mangrove forests, for example, that will make a huge difference to be able to draw carbon out the atmosphere and put our oceans into recovery in a way that helps tackle the climate crisis. And of course, our coral reefs are hugely threatened by climate change. When we hear politicians talking about the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees, actually that's the difference really between whether our coral reefs survive or not. So we need to see a lot more attention and focus on our oceans and really understand the role that our oceans can play in fighting the climate crisis. So today is the Global Day of Action for COP, and you can always tell when there's protests or marches going on here in Glasgow because you always have a police helicopter flying overhead belching out carbon emissions. Sort of quite ironic, isn't it? Today is that Global Day of Action, and it's incredibly exciting. In over 200 cities across the world, people will be getting out into the streets and making their point made very firmly about the need for much faster, much deeper action to tackle the climate and nature crisis. And I'm delighted to say that Wildlife Trust staff and volunteers and supporters will be out in cities across the UK joining in those marches, because it is public pressure and pressure from the grassroots that's making a difference to the politics around climate and nature crisis here. I've been to many COPs over the years, and at this one there's one thing that does feel a little bit different. Is I want to believe I'm starting to see a little bit of fear in the eyes of some of the politicians. They do see the children, the young people on the streets in particular over the last few years, marching for Fridays for the Future with that amazing leadership from Greta. And I think that has made a huge difference to the politics around climate. And so we saw that again here in Glasgow yesterday. We saw a Fridays for the Future march in Glasgow yesterday. Thousands and thousands of young people on the streets. Again, Greta speaking and saying some very powerful and true words that need to be said to the crowd in Glasgow. And there's going to be an even bigger march today here in Glasgow as well. Let's hope that really continues to make the difference, and we actually start to see governments scaling up the pace and depth of the action they need to take to tackle the climate and nature crisis.
The UK government has a target to meet net greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. So what do we need to do to meet that target? Well, for a start, obviously, we need to drastically cut our emissions and become a more sustainable society. But nature can also help us in the fight by locking away carbon and helping us to tackle climate change. These nature-based solutions, such as our woodlands, our peatlands, our salt marshes and our seabed, are all fantastic stores of carbon and help us tackle the climate emergency. What we're going to see now is a film by the People's Postcode Lottery and the Wildlife Trust, looking at the work we've been doing for nature-based solutions and to try and tackle the climate and nature emergency.
The Wildlife Trusts are on a mission to restore nature and combat climate change And thanks to players of People's Postcode Lottery, we've started to make some real progress. Many are big, ambitious projects, such as restoring underwater seagrass meadows in Hampshire, home to amazing wildlife, but also capturing carbon as the new shoots grow. Along the coast in Essex, Coya sausages are being installed to improve the salt marsh there, trapping sediment and providing habitat for salt-loving plants to make a comeback, whilst providing a huge carbon store. Just like the peatlands in Yorkshire, where volunteers are planting tiny fragments of sphagnum moss to restore these carbon-storing powerhouses that also clean our water and protect us from flooding. The wetlands that span the England and Wales border are also of huge importance, with a number of wildlife trusts working collaboratively to improve them and create the right habitat for beavers, our ecosystem engineers. In Bedfordshire, researchers and volunteers are exploring new ways to help chalk grassland butterflies. They're creating experimental mounds that each provide little microhabitats, which they hope will help butterflies to adapt to the local effects of climate change. Education is also key, which is why we've created brand new teaching resources to help inspire children to be climate heroes whilst they learn about nature's superpowers at the same time. Finally, we all know that change must start at home. We are looking at how we can do more to reduce our own carbon footprint, from providing electric vehicle charging points and incentivising staff to use public transport or car share, to working with nature to generate the energy we use. By each taking action, whether big or small, we can tackle the nature and climate crises together.
Yesterday, we spoke to Sven Rasmussen, Reserves Manager at the Scottish Wildlife Trust, about the vital work the Scottish Wildlife Trust have been doing in restoring peatlands in Calder Moss, just south of Glasgow.
Hello, and welcome to Calder Moss Wildlife Reserve. I'm Sven Rasmussen, a Reserve Manager for the Scottish Wildlife Trust. I'm here at Calder Moss, next to the busy M74 motorway, just 18 miles from the COP26 summit in Glasgow. Calder Moss is a raised bog, and it comes under the broader category of habitats known as peatlands. Peatlands like this are vital to combating the nature and climate emergencies because of the huge quantities of carbon locked up in the peat. They're also amazing places for biodiversity, and they provide a habitat for a unique range of plants and animals. Scotland is home to nearly 70% of the UK's peatlands, but here in Scotland, as in the rest of the UK, they're in trouble. Over 80% of Scotland's peatlands are degraded, and many of them have been damaged or lost completely to a whole range of pressures, such as draining, afforestation, burning, overgrazing, peat extraction, and erosion. Damaged peatlands emit carbon dioxide, so it's vital to repair and protect these habitats. We need to protect and restore peatlands like this, and we need funding to do it. Initiatives like the Scottish Government's Peatland Action Programme funded a huge restoration project here at Calder Moss, felling and removing conifer trees that were sucking up water from the bog and drying it out, and then using special low ground pressure machines to create bunds, like a series of paddling pools along the edge of the bog to hold water and keep it healthy. With help, the Scottish Wildlife Trust is working to safeguard peatlands like Calder Moss, making them even better for nature, the climate and people.
That's it from us, and thank you so much for joining us on this special daily update all about nature and nature-based solutions. I hope you've been inspired to maybe sign our petition to ban the use of peat for compost and ensure that you don't buy peat when shopping for your compost at the garden centre. Now, don't forget, we won't be with you tomorrow. Instead, we've got a very special wildlife panel event coming to you live from Glasgow. That's at 7 p.m. tomorrow. The link to sign up is in the chat. Look forward to seeing you then.